So, today I want to talk about the book of Ezra, or Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, for the period after the exile, for the period before the exile, you have a historical account in the books of Samuel and Kings. Whatever problems it may have, it gives you a narrative. And it's a way, something that you can kind of peg things into. Now, for the period after the exile, all we have are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. After that, the next historical narrative will be in the books of Maccabees, and that's down in the 2nd century. We also have the books of Chronicles, which were written after the exile, but they only go back over the history that was in the book of Kings. It's really a kind of rewriting of Kings. Now, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah have all sorts of historical problems. They cite a lot of documents, some of which may be authentic and some of which surely are not. But they're all we have. Beyond that, you have an account of this period in the historian Josephus at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, and Josephus in turn was heavily dependent on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, there are 3 components in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra chapters 1 to 6 are dealing with the problems of rebuilding the temple, also problems of building a wall around Jerusalem. The chronology seems to be a bit mixed up. But we're not going to address that part in this class. Beginning in Ezra chapter 7, you have what is called the Ezra Memoir, although some of it you would have to be rewritten. It's not all a first-person memoir. And then in Nehemiah, we have a Nehemiah memoir. But chapters 8 through 10 of Nehemiah belong to the Ezra account, which makes it a bit confusing. And even though at the beginning of chapter 8 of Nehemiah, both figures are mentioned together, it is universally agreed that Nehemiah doesn't belong there. That was just about Ezra. And in fact, he isn't in the Greek translation, so his name probably got into it a bit later on. So, in any case, what I'll be mainly talking about this morning is the supposed Ezra memoir, or at least the account of the campaign of Ezra. As to the date, there is no dispute about the date of Nehemiah. He came to Jerusalem in 445 BCE. In the case of Ezra, he is said to have come in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. But there were 3 Artaxerxes. Now, usually, he is thought to have come in the 7th year of the 1st Artaxerxes. That would bring him to Jerusalem in 458, before Nehemiah. The alternative possibility is that he came in 398, under a later Artaxerxes. I think it's possible the main reason people prefer the earlier date is that the book of Ezra comes before the book of Nehemiah. And that's not a terribly strong argument, but it's not going to make too much difference to us one way or the other. Ezra is important because he is the one who is credited with bringing the book of the Torah back to Jerusalem. Now, the book of the Torah, in the reign of King Josiah, you had a reform, which I presume you dealt with last semester. This is thought to be based on some early form of the book of Deuteronomy. And for Josiah, Deuteronomy, or some part of it, was the Torah. Now, it's also pretty universally agreed that the Pentateuch as we have it was put together in the Babylonian exile by priests who were exiled from Jerusalem. And that involved the combination of the different sources, the narrative sources that we call J and D, and then the priestly source. Now, it is with Ezra, it's Ezra who is credited with bringing the combined Torah back to Jerusalem. And that makes him a rather important figure in the history of Judaism. Some people would look at him even as a kind of new Moses, as the person who refounds Judaism after the exile. But let's start with Ezra chapter 7. After this, in the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, etc. That's one of these passages put in there to provide a nice exam question sometime. What was the genealogy of Ezra? And all the way back to son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of the chief priest Aaron. This Ezra went up from Babylon, from Babylonia. Now, that's the only indication you get, really, that he was a priest. I don't see any great reason to doubt that he was a priest. Some people have thought he was being sent as a high priest, but that isn't right. Because when he gets there, you find that he hands over some things that he brought from Babylon to the high priest. So the book never claims that he was high priest. And he was certainly a scribe. Now, what is a scribe? Well, a scribe is somebody who can write. And there weren't so many of them. This was not something to be taken for granted in the ancient world. Back in the time of Josiah, there were scribes who put together the book of Deuteronomy. Jeremiah didn't like them. He said that the Torah had been changed into falsehood by the lying pen of the scribes. But you see, the scribes were the people who actually compiled the writings. So they had enormous power in that sense. A lot of people couldn't read, and so you were very dependent on what the scribe told you was in the book. Now, evidently, Ezra was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. That's the only indication that you get here that he asked for something. But the impression one gets is that Ezra went to the king and asked for permission to go back to Jerusalem and introduce this law book. Nehemiah, we're told, was a cupbearer to the king, and he asked to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. Now, this is sometimes called Persian Authorization. There was a big debate about this about 20 years ago as to the Persian Authorization of the Pentateuch. And it was controversial because it makes it sound like the Pentateuch was devised for the purposes of the Persian Empire. That isn't quite right, but I think you did have to have imperial authorization. In order for Ezra to go to Jerusalem and say, this is the law by which you should live, he needed the backing of the empire. You don't at any point get the impression that the emperor cared a fig what was in this law. It was never translated into Aramaic, which you would think would have been step one if the Persians had any concern about the content. So I think what happens here is that Ezra says, look, this is our law, we would like to live by this law, and the king says, if that will keep you happy and lead you to pay your tribute without Making a fuss about it? Sure, go ahead. So, according to this, then, this is a copy of the letter King Artaxerxes gave to the priest Ezra. There are several Persian letters like this in the book of Ezra, and it's the first book where you get documents cited. Some of them may be authentic. This one seems kind of dubious because the king is far too generous in it. The Artaxerxes, king of kings, to the priest Ezra, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, peace. And now, I decree that any of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offer to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God which is in your hand, and to convey the silver and gold that the king and his counselors freely offer to the God of Israel. And he supposedly then gives him silver and gold and tells him, with all diligence, buy bulls, rams, and lambs, and you shall offer them on the altar of the house of your God in Jerusalem. And the vessels that have been given you for the service of the house of your God, you shall deliver to Jerusalem. And whatever else is required for the house of your God, which you are responsible for providing, you may provide out of the king's treasury. That's the bit that strains credibility. Persian kings did not give people blank checks. We have papyri from the period, from the south of Egypt, and we have correspondence in which you can see the way the Persians dealt with situations like this, and they tended to be very specific, but not anything you need. That seems a little bit too much. That said, though, I don't think there is any reason to doubt that Ezra did get authorization to bring back this law. At least we know somebody at some point made the law of Moses the official law of Judah. If it wasn't Ezra, it might as well be somebody else by the same name. Because we have no other story about it. And when you get down into the Hellenistic period, it is assumed. Now, you don't hear of the book of the law of Moses in the prophets Haggai or Zechariah, or in 3rd Isaiah, and as we will see in a minute, when Ezra gets to Jerusalem, it is apparent that people are not familiar with it, that people don't know a whole lot about it. In the first part of the book of Ezra, they say that when the first people came back, they observed all the festivals and offered all the sacrifices. But that seems quite implausible, because when Ezra gets there, nobody seems to have had a clue as to what they were supposed to do. Now, to see what this law was, we won't get the full picture of it, but you will at least see some of it. Turn to Nehemiah chapter 8. When the 7th month came, does anybody know what's the significance of the 7th month in the Jewish calendar? It's the month with Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. You see, you have 2 different calendars being played off here. Is that if the New Year is the traditional Jewish religious New Year in the fall, but that the 7th month is referring to the Babylonian calendar. So it's because you have all the Jewish festivals. This, if you are in class with some Jewish colleagues or have taken class from a Jewish professor, you notice that sometime in the middle of the fall, things go a little bit crazy, because all these holidays come up in quick succession. But in this case, in any case, all the people gathered together in the square before the water gate in Jerusalem. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, and accordingly Ezra brought the law before the assembly. Both men and women, all who could hear with understanding. This was the first day of the 7th month. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday. The scribe Ezra stood on a wooden platform, and beside him were a string of people, and Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people. He was standing above all the people, and he opened it, and the people stood up. Now, this is, quite an elaborate ceremony, reminiscent in ways of what you might expect to find in a synagogue service at a later time. But here it's a big production, because he wants to impress on people that he has this book. Now, one of the ways you make an impression on people is show it to them. They may not be able to understand what is in it, but they will be impressed. And evidently they're impressed here. And all the people stood up, and they answered, Amen, Amen. And they bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And so forth, you have this reading, and the Levites, we're told, then went around and explained it to the people. Because it may well be that many of the people didn't understand the Hebrew at this point, and in any case, they may have needed a little commentary on it. Now, it may be, before I go ahead with this, it may be well to keep in mind what was supposed to happen in the 7th month. And that you get in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, verse 24 and following. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of complete rest, a holy convocation commemorated with trumpet blasts. This is Rosh Hashanah. Then, on the 10th day in the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Arguably the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar traditionally. You shall deny yourselves and present the Lord's offering by fire. You shall do no work during that day to make atonement on your behalf before the Lord your God. And then on the 15th day of this month, and lasting 7 days, there shall be the festival of booths, or tabernacles, Sukkot, when you make little tents or little booths, huts in your yard and live in booths in commemoration of the Exodus. Now, when we go back then to Nehemiah 8, this first reading of the law might arguably be Rosh Hashanah, and although it doesn't really describe it in the same terms that you have in Leviticus. On the 2nd day, the heads of the ancestral houses of all the people came together to the scribe Ezra in order to study the words of the law. And they found it written in the law, which the Lord commanded by Moses, that the people of Israel should live in booths during the festival of the 7th month. Now, they're discovering this, with a little less than 2 weeks to spare before it's due to happen, and that they should publish and proclaim in all their towns, Go to the hills, bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves. And in the courts of the house of God and in the square. And all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in them, For from the days of Jeshua son of Nun, that's Joshua, to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. Now, that's disregard anything you may have read if you read Ezra chapter 6. This is a fairly plain statement that they didn't do this before the time of Ezra. And also, when they got out the scroll to read in it, they were surprised by what they found. Nobody seems to have known that they were supposed to do this. Not only that, but on the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and in sackcloth and with earth on their heads. Now, that sounds like what you might have expected on Yom Kippur. But Yom Kippur, according to Leviticus, was supposed to be on the 10th day of the month. What may one infer from all of this? Well, I think what you may infer is that what Ezra is introducing is something like what you get in the priestly strand of the Pentateuch, but it isn't finalized yet. Now, one of the big revelations of the Dead Sea Scrolls was that even a couple of hundred years after this, people were still messing with the text of the Pentateuch. Scribes were making corrections. You get some scrolls where they combine things in different ways, try to explain away some of the problems in them. But it was not yet quite a finished product. Now, the earliest of the Dead Sea Scrolls are probably 2nd century BCE. They were a good deal more settled by then than they were in the time of Ezra. But you can see that in the case of Ezra, you have the main ingredients. You haven't quite got them in the right order yet. And you haven't quite finalized what exactly it was that you were supposed to do on it. Now, what does it mean then to live by the law of Moses? Well, you might think that means you don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, etc. Those things were probably assumed. You probably didn't need the law of Moses to have some sense of those obligations. There are two big things in the eyes of Ezra. The first one is keep the festivals. That's what you get in Nehemiah 8 and 9. And you see, this is one of the ways in which you would signal to people that you were now living by the law of Moses. There was another issue that comes up as well, and this has to do with intermarriage. In Ezra chapter 9, after these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, "The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites." Now, again, nice exam question. From which people had the people of Israel not separated themselves, according to Ezra? For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus, the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. Now, two striking things about this. First of all, there is a precedent in the Torah as we have it, and that precedent is in Deuteronomy chapter 23. That those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt. But you shall not abhor any of the Edomites, for they are your kin, and you shall not abhor any of the Egyptians, because you were an alien residing in their land. So it seems like Ezra is expanding the ban a little bit. You know, that he has a precedent for excluding some foreigners. Ezra pretty much excludes every foreigner he can think of. Part of the expansion comes from another passage in Deuteronomy where the Israelites were commanded to annihilate the various peoples who lived in the land. But there is no precedent in the Torah itself for banning Egyptians, funnily enough. But Ezra, now this, it raises a question that remains with us to this day, probably. What exactly is the Torah? What exactly is the law? And the law is never just the words on the page. The law always has some context, has some further implications, assumptions that come with it, so that the words on the page usually are just taken as a kind of pointer to the law. It gives you the essence of it, maybe, but there is always more to it in practice. In other words, some things are always assumed to be part of the law, even though they're never written in it. Now, that will be a controversial issue down to the present time. Yes?
I'm sorry, this is a stupid question. I'm just kind of trying to pick up the timeline here, which I guess is also a stupid thing to say, because that's what people have been trying to do for 100 years. But, so we have Ezra coming back with some version of a simple Torah.
Yes.
And you're talking about there being precedent in Deuteronomy for this kind of ban, which suggests that Deuteronomy preceded it. So that there was some sort of Deuteronomistic strain that theoretically showed up during kind of King Josiah's time that Ezra was working on and had developed before back.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Now, actually, again, without trying to explain the arguments for this because they're a bit too complicated, most people would figure that what Ezra brought back was essentially the Torah as we have it, except that in some details it may not have been quite the same. And the main evidence that it wasn't quite the same is the fact that he doesn't have Yom Kippur on the right day. So that some things don't seem to have been quite finalized yet. But he does seem to have had what we call D, the Deuteronomy, and P. Now, the novelty of it was probably the introduction of P. Now, I might add that we have a papyrus, which I'll actually be discussing in my other course this week, from Elephantine in the south of Egypt, which was sent. There was a community, a small Jewish community of mercenaries down in the south of Egypt, working for the Persians. And in the year 419, because we actually have a date on the papyrus, this letter was sent to them through the governor of Egypt, telling them how to observe, or what dates to observe, the especially unleavened bread, which goes with the Passover. And I think it's quite explicit because it gives you the dates that are mentioned in Leviticus as the dates for observing unleavened bread. Now, in the other sources in the Pentateuch, like Deuteronomy, you do not get the dates. It's the priestly source that specified the dates. And so it looks very much that in 419, this would have been probably a few decades after Ezra, somebody heard, there are Jews down in the south of Egypt and they're not doing this right. Let's get the word out to them. Interestingly enough, they did not send them a copy of the Torah. There were probably two reasons for that. First of all, they probably couldn't have read it. They would have spoken Aramaic, not Hebrew. Nobody felt up to translating the Torah into Aramaic at that point. And the other thing was, it was expensive to make a copy. So they just cherry-picked and told them, these are the things you need to do. You see, what observance of the law usually amounts to is observance of a few things that have high symbolic value. And that's why you have the festivals, and intermarriage now will come up as another big issue. These are things that everyone could see whether you were observing or not. And those are the things that they tend to focus on. Now, in chapter 9 then, after these things had been done, the officials approached me and told me that the holy seed has not been preserved. Now, this is the first time in the Bible that you hear of holy seed. The idea being that holiness is transmitted genetically. Now, you will get this repeated later on in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other texts, but this is an innovation in the book of Ezra. It is the idea that the holy people is holy in virtue of its genetic transmission. That's a rather startling claim. And it's introduced here, you see, apropos of the question of intermarriage. So when Ezra heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle, and pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. You can picture him. He has quite a fit. And then all who trembled at the words of the Lord, the God of Israel, gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. And at that point there is a long prayer. And in chapter 10, while Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, and said, we have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Now, this this may have seemed like a good idea to whoever wrote the book of Ezra. It doesn't play so well in a modern reading. First of all, you wonder, it's a case of Judean or Israelite men marrying foreign women. It's not a complaint of Jewish women marrying foreign men. What exactly is going on there? Now, traditionally, later on in rabbinic Judaism, Judaism is transmitted through the mother. If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. Maybe this was already implicit here. Some people also wonder just who qualified as foreign, because some of it may have had to do with people coming back from the exile and then marrying people who were living in the land. Now, one reason to do that would be to get the land, to get title to the property. And probably there was some of that. But also there is an implication here, I think that maybe that those who were never in Babylon, those who were never part of the exile community, are suspect. These become people of the land, and therefore not to be trusted. Now, it isn't 100% clear here whether Ezra is objecting to marrying Judeans who did not go into exile. That's just reading between the lines, and some people suspect it. But, it seems remarkable enough. Now, of course, even if there were probably also some people who weren't Judeans at all, who had come into the land when the exiles had been taken away. And no doubt, I think, property had a good deal to do with it. But in any case, this is the recipe that Ezra proposes, and that is to send away the foreign women and their children. If you send them away, where do they go? Well, probably not too far away, but traditionally, a divorced woman goes back to her father's house. Now, that may be, that may be another reason to focus on the women. In a way, they had a place to go. But divorce, is always assumed. It's always assumed that divorce is permissible. But the man initiates the divorce. Actually, in the papyri from Elephantina in the south of Egypt, you get cases where a woman could divorce a man, but that was exceptional, and that was peculiar to the context in Egypt. But divorce here is pretty much taken for granted. And so then he assembles all the people in the rain, and after a while they said, okay, let us sit out in the rain and we'll sign anything. So they agree to this covenant, and they list only a few people who objected to it. And it gives you a list then of all these people who had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. Did Ezra do a good thing in purging the people like this? Because intermarriage is still a huge issue in Judaism. On the one hand, the prohibition of intermarriage is probably what has preserved Judaism down through the centuries. Other people say Moabites, Edomites, all of these people have kind of disappeared from history because they just assimilated, mingled, borders eroded. Now, on the other hand, that comes with a cost. And comes with a cost in particular for the women and children in this situation. And it's always an issue then, how do you weigh the needs of preserving a distinct identity on the one hand, over against humane treatment on the other? And you will get different voices on that. Now, what people actually thought of it in the time of Ezra is also an open question. Ezra disappears from history very fast. If it is true that he came to Jerusalem before Nehemiah, then when Nehemiah showed up about 12 years later, he saw a lot of the same problems that Ezra had seen in the first case. And in the book of Nehemiah, he complains of people working on the Sabbath and not giving the tithes to the Levites and all the other things that they were supposed to do. Joe Blenkinsop, who wrote a commentary on Ezra, used to suggest that when word got back to the Persians that Ezra had made a whole bunch of people divorce their wives and children and send them away, that he was whisked back to Babylon, and that's why we hear no more about him afterwards. But again, that's just guesswork. We don't know exactly what happened. We do, though, have an interesting passage in the last of the prophetic books, the book of Malachi, and that touches on the subject of divorce. Malachi is very critical of the priesthood of the time, very critical of the way the people were or were not observing the cult. And in chapter 2 of Malachi, he says, have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why then are we faithless to one another? And then a little bit further down, and this you do as well, you cover the Lord's altar. This is chapter 2, verse 13. With weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor at your hand. You ask, why not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Now, the text of the next verse is corrupt. And I think the way it should be translated, you see, in the NRSV you have did not one God make her, but I think that should be translated, did not God make one, flesh and spirit in it. And that it's alluding to Genesis, where Adam and Eve are said to become one flesh. Now, if I'm right on that, this is the first passage in the Bible that invokes Genesis, as the standard of marriage and prohibits divorce because of it. So, did he not make one, flesh and spirit in it? And what does the one seek for one? What does the one seek? But what's there's a gun there. But godly offspring. So look to yourselves and do not let anyone be faithless to the wife of his youth. Now, the line in verse 16 is translated here, for I hate divorce. But that again isn't quite right, because the word is a participle, and what it should mean is for one hates. Now, the formula for a divorce in the papyri from Elephantina, if you want to divorce a woman, you say, I hate my wife. Really, it means I repudiate. And that's what it's alluding to here. For one repudiates, divorces, and sends away, and covers one's garment with violence. Now that is, I believe, the only passage in the Old Testament that condemns divorce. And I think it does condemn it. It's not a law, but it's a prophet denouncing the custom of divorce. It got changed in transmission. I think the reason the text became corrupt is that people couldn't quite accept it. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a version of this text that says, if you hate, divorce, which is changing it into a recommendation of divorce. And I think that's because the idea of prohibiting divorce was so alien to the culture. You will get it again in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and again based on Genesis chapter 1, and then it becomes a controversial issue in the Gospels. And even in the Gospels, you get a couple of cases that prohibit divorce completely, and another one that says, except in a case of unchastity, which is added in, I think, saying he couldn't really have meant that there's no circumstance at all where you can't divorce. And also in the Gospels, you get the reaction of the disciples saying, if that is the case, wouldn't it be better not to marry at all? But this was, a turning point in a way. I mean, it's certainly in much of Western tradition, then divorce was frowned on. But this was exceptional in the case of Malachi. I am tempted to think that Malachi was reacting to the action of Ezra. You can't prove that. We don't actually know precisely. We know that Malachi was written sometime in the Persian period, because he uses the Persian word for the governor. But whether it was written directly in response to it or not, it's certainly a very different point of view. And also in the case of Malachi, this I think would be the first case where Genesis chapter 1 is being invoked as the standard. And this, you see, was part of the priestly strand, and that would go with the recent acceptance of the priestly source as foundational to the Torah. Questions or comments? Yeah. You would think. Now, I mean, there were certainly people, foreign-born people who became Judeans. And there was, so to speak, a path to citizenship, but it required a few generations before people were accepted as part of it. You don't really get conversion with the conversion ceremony until the Maccabean period. And in the Maccabean period, there are a couple of famous or notorious cases where the Maccabees insisted that some people get circumcised and thereby get converted. Now, there are also stories about the conversion of women, but that's all later. It's all in the Maccabean period. I don't think they have quite gotten to that point here yet. Martha.
Aside from the phrase holy seed, how does that, like, foreigners are not accepted in Ezra differ from how foreigners are not accepted in Leviticus?
Oh, I think he's very much in line with Leviticus and with Ezekiel. But calling it the holy seed, it's a step. It makes it more explicit. Well, I mean, adoption was certainly known in the ancient world. Now, I do not know of a case where you have Jewish parents adopting a non-Jewish child. It may have happened, but I don't think it's recorded.
It seems like the sort of thing that Leviticus might approve of, but Ezra might not.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay, so on Wednesday, midterm exam, and no class on Friday.